Russians seem to be highly disorganized, highly, do you still understand me?
Yes.
Secondly, the Russians seem to be highly disorganized, and their strategic warfare seems to be bordering on the incompetence. Thirdly, of course, it is Western support, Western heavy weaponry, Western intelligence information, which is provided to the Ukrainians, which has helped Ukraine and their war effort a lot. And I think that explains why Ukraine so far seems to have had the upper hand in the war, even in eastern Ukraine, where Russia, because it is close to the Russian border, where Russia has been in charge of Luhansk and Donetsk for quite some time. But even there in eastern Ukraine, Russia cannot gain a quick victory, to the surprise of many military strategists. And it is now, people even talk about the fact that Russia may lose the war, that Russia may not even achieve any of its goals. And the consequences of that for Putin himself and for his regime and the Kremlin, we don't know for sure. Personally, I don't think that the Russians will clearly lose the war and just give up and concede defeat. It will probably continue into a long guerrilla war for a significant period of time. I cannot see that Putin, unless there are some serious health problems or there is a coup in the Kremlin, which I can't see either, but it is pretty difficult to see that Putin and his regime will concede defeat and will withdraw from Ukraine. So what are we going to do in order to prevent a ceasefire? I think to prevent a guerrilla war. The only way forward is really to achieve a ceasefire. And we have seen the mediation efforts of a number of countries, not least Turkey and Israel, but nothing really has led to anything which can be called a ceasefire. Even the exchange of prisoners of war, the release of civilians from cities like Mariupol has been quite difficult and has been marred by continued fighting. And some of these so-called humanitarian corridors have not been observed, but have been further attacked. So if even humanitarian efforts cannot succeed to get civilians out of cities like Mariupol and others, how could possibly an overall ceasefire work? And this is very much the question. So we need more mediation. We need an even greater attempt by Turkey to do something about the situation. And of course, there is one country, I believe, which is still sitting on the sidelines, and that country is China. China would have the possibility to put pressure on Putin, because China is Putin's only main ally on the international scene. There are other countries, such as India, for example, who are also sitting on the fence, who have not condemned Russia's invasion, but they cannot really be called active supporters of Russia. They really try to be neutral as much as they can. But China, of course, is not neutral. China, particularly in its domestic comments, is very much in the pro-Russian camp. On the international level, China is a bit more careful, but domestically it comes out with very strong support, rhetorical support of Russia. And here I think China could play a greater role to achieve a ceasefire and to put pressure on Putin to enter into serious negotiations with the Zelensky government in Ukraine. And whether the Ukrainians would accept China as a mediator, we don't know, of course, but I believe that any sensible way forward to achieve an immediate end to the war would probably be welcomed by Zelensky, never mind the rhetoric which is sometimes coming out of Kiev, which says that there are only certain conditions which on which such a ceasefire needs to be based. Let me just maybe talk about why China is in such support of Russia in the war. First of all, I think there are 3 points one can make about that. First of all, Russia is China's only powerful and influential geopolitical partner. And both countries, in a way, need each other on the world stage and in the UN Security Council to support each other's autocratic policies. So for Russia to give up on China or for China to give up on Russia would make no sense from a geopolitical point of view if you look at the world from the perspective of either Moscow or Beijing. Secondly, Russia has the ability to provide China with resources such as gas, oil, coal, wheat, and other agricultural products. And this is immensely valuable for Beijing. We know we live in a world of sanctions, in a world of decoupling, as some people say. And China is, of course, interested in maintaining access to the most important products to feed its population, to continue its standard of living. And these essentials, these resources, like, as I said, gas, oil, coal, agricultural products, these are often coming from Russia. So for China to become more critical toward Russia regarding the war in Ukraine does not make geopolitical or geoeconomic sense. And that is, of course, talking from a very hard-nosed, realistic point of view. This has very little to do with humanitarian feelings or with feelings of feeling, outraged by what is actually happening on the ground in the war in Ukraine. Certainly, under Xi Jinping, China's belief in the possibility of replacing the United States as a primary global power on Earth has grown, and animosity to American influence and norm-setting ability has significantly increased. And that is what China and Russia share. And I think China's and Russia's shared grievance against the dominant role of the United States in international affairs also brings them together and makes China support Russia, at least indirectly, in the war in Ukraine. This would bring me to my third point, and that is the future of the global order. And this is a difficult topic. What will the world look like when we look at the time after the end of the war in Ukraine? First of all, it is not imaginable that we can go back to a situation as if nothing had happened. Russia, and recently the American Secretary of Defense Austin said that Russia has to be weakened so that it would not be able to do or embark on a similar attack. And while that was not the goal at the beginning of the war or even before the war, I think in the meantime, Putin's Russia will not be allowed to continue as it is at the moment. There either has to be a more democratic change in the Kremlin, or there has to be a clear military weakening of the Putin regime. This will be resisted with all force and means by Russia and also by some of its allies and friends. Therefore, I believe you will see a very long, drawn-out war in Ukraine. We will not see a quick end. I'm very pessimistic about the mediation efforts which I mentioned before. I do not think that they will come to fruition unless really a miracle happens. Secondly, what about the role of nuclear weapons? I cannot see that Putin will employ nuclear weapons, and no one else will employ nuclear weapons. However, if Putin was pushed into a corner, if the very existence of his regime was at stake, then perhaps at this very last stage, he might use a tactical nuclear weapon, which is meant to be a small nuclear weapon, still more powerful than the weapon in Hiroshima, and still, you know, it would be a disaster to anything like that. Thirdly, I think, and that is the assessment in the American State Department, is that the future clash of the world will be between China and the United States. And on the whole, I believe that is probably the case. The United States politicians are focused totally on the so-called threat from China. That is the technological and economic threat, as I see it, but also the military threat in the South Pacific. Comparisons are being drawn increasingly between the situation in Taiwan and the situation in Ukraine, and whether an attack on Taiwan could happen anytime soon, as Russia kind of unexpectedly for the majority in the Western world attacked Ukraine. Personally, I don't think that that will be the case in the near future at all. But preparations are being made that this may occur. Fourthly, what is the role of the rest of the world regarding the global order in the future? And I'm afraid to say that continents such as Africa or the Middle East will continue to be marginalized. I cannot see that countries such as South Africa or Iran or Saudi Arabia will play particularly major roles. They will continue to be supporting actors, I would say, as they are now. Important supporting actors, but they will not play a major role in the great power struggle of the future. What about the Europeans? And I'm, as you know, I'm European yourself. The Europeans now, in the form of the EU, support the war, support the American effort in the war in Ukraine via NATO very, very significantly. And we have all been surprised about the coherence and unity of the European Union. Everyone, including Putin, expected that the European Union would not stick together, that NATO would dissolve over its friction, how to conduct the war in Ukraine, whether or not to put sanctions on Russia and what sort of sanctions. But so far, the European Union has actually proven to be quite coherent and quite united. We see at the moment the differences occur between over oil and gas and other resources which ought to be cut off from Russia. But these are, I believe, largely disputes over finances. Hungary does not wish to stop oil, particularly oil and gas delivery from Russia coming into Europe, particularly into Hungary, of course. And the reason why is that Hungary is totally dependent on the Russian pipeline to pump oil and gas into Hungary. Hungary is a landlocked country. They do not have access to deliveries by sea, so they are dependent on that pipeline coming from Russia to Hungary. Therefore, they have vetoed so far all attempts to cut off oil and gas coming from Russia into the European Union. However, that looks like a very serious fight between Hungary and the rest of the European Union, but I think it's all about money. If enough money was promised to Orban in Hungary to develop his refinery capacities, to obtain alternative sources of particularly oil from elsewhere, like the Middle East, then he probably could be placated. There also is a clash brewing over law of rights violations and about the role of the Justice Department in Hungarian domestic politics. and Hungary has been punished by the European Union about these issues. And I think Orban also uses the opportunity with the pipelines from Russia to tell the EU, you have to make concessions in these points, otherwise I will veto sanctions on Russian oil and gas coming into Europe. So in the end, I think there is a serious dispute looming, but in the end, I think European unity will probably prevail, and and Hungary will give in, though that will be quite expensive to placate the Hungarians. In the future, when we look at the global world order, the Europeans, however, will play an important role, but they still will be play a supporting role to the United States. I cannot see that French President Macron's idea about strategic autonomy for Europe will be realized. By strategic autonomy, he means, in a way, he means decoupling to some extent of Europe from the United States. That the United States should develop its own military resources, should stand much more on its feet also in trade and economic matters, and lastly also in political matters. While this ambition has been much applauded both in France and also in Germany and other European countries, I think it is largely an ambition. Particularly among the Eastern European countries, there's no desire to move away from the United States. While the French have always had that inclination to view the United States' role in Europe skeptically, that goes back to Charles de Gaulle of the 1950s and 1960s, if not sooner. This Gaullist policy is largely not supported on the rest of the European continent. And the Germans themselves, the second important country in Europe, is dubious about whether it makes sense to loosen the link between Europe and the United States. While everyone at the moment is in favor of increasing Europe's military capacity, and that is even welcomed by the United States, that does not mean that most Europeans want to loosen the links to NATO, want to set up an alternative to NATO, let's say, or want to do away with America's nuclear umbrella, which in the last resort protects the Europeans. Therefore, it will not be a multilateral world, which we will see in the future, but it will be largely a bilateral world. It will be a world which will be dominated by the United States and China. However, I do not believe that war is imminent, as Graham Allison a few years ago mentioned in his very popular book, The Thucydides Trap. A G2 world is certainly not an ideal world. G2 meaning two great powers dominate everything. And I think conflict can be avoided, because it is not in the sense, it is not to the advantage of either the United States or China to embark on military conflict. Hello? But constructive cooperation is possible. And what we see at the moment, when we look at the decoupling of the Chinese and American economies, when we see of the increasingly lack of contact and communication between China and the United States, this is not something we should welcome. We should actually engage with the other side in order to understand the other side, and also intensify links of communication again. This is, of course, difficult with China right now, because China takes this anti-COVID strategy very seriously, the zero COVID strategy. So it's very difficult to travel to China. Even officials and diplomats find it extremely difficult to travel there without having to undergo strict quarantine conditions. And Zoom meetings, as we know, are not always ideal to discuss important and sensitive topics. But unfortunately, I think we are heading towards a G2 world, and we need to avoid that comes to a military clash over Taiwan, for example, over the South China Sea, and other issues indeed. The Europeans will continue to be on the side of the United States, I believe, despite all attempts by Macron and others, all friction, perhaps not to do so, perhaps to loosen its influence on the United States. But I don't think that will, in the end, will happen. Whenever I'm asked by Chinese interviews or journalists about whether Europe is about to side with the Chinese, I believe this is wishful thinking on the part of China. For cultural reasons, for political reasons, for, of course, important economic reasons, but also military and security reasons, there is no desire among most European countries to loosen their links with the United States and to move closer to China. Never mind the close economic and trade relations between countries such as Germany, for example, and China. I cannot see that that Europe will free itself, as some people say, from the United States. And if you have a president such as Joe Biden, who is clearly very pro-transatlantic, very pro-European, this will certainly not happen. If you have the return of Trump or someone like Trump coming back into the White House in 2024, then of course things change again. And here then again, we may see a certain loosening of the European link to the United States. But this will still be a very long-term process. This will not happen within 4 years or overnight. So the future of the global order, in my view, will be dominated by two large nation states and their allies and supporters. And the challenge for all of us is not to have a world divided into two, like we had it during the Cold War, which was dangerous enough, but to continue having engaged relations, having constructive cooperation between these two powers. And I think it is not too late to achieve that, because there are many issues where both countries, the United States and China, actually have to cooperate. When you look at Taiwan and the South China Sea, you can see where the clash might happen. But if you look at climate change, at environmental issues, at resources which are necessary for all developed industrial nations, then of course you also know that cooperation is totally necessary for the Earth to survive and for the industrial nations of the world to survive and flourish. And I think the way around all the problems at the moment is by focusing on cooperation and not by focusing on the points which actually divide us. And that was what was exactly done in already in the 1972 Shanghai Communique between Nixon and Kissinger and Mao and Zhou Enlai in China, which led to the opening and to the beginning of Chinese-American relations in the modern period. When Kissinger and Zhou Enlai sat together and wanted to draw up that, so what later came to be called the Shanghai Communique in 1972, they looked at that long list of issues where both countries strongly disagreed. And Zhou Enlai wanted to submit that as the official communique. And Kissinger turned around and told Zhou Enlai, we can't do that. The president has to go back home and show successes. He cannot go back home and just have a long list of issues where we disagree. We need to focus on something else. So they focused on the 5 or 6 issues at the time, where a much shorter list, where they could agree on, where they could cooperate on. And that was the list which Nixon emphasized, which he took back home, with which he convinced the American Congress and the American people to open up relations with China and to start engaging with China. And I think this is probably the recipe for today as well. We should not just focus on Taiwan and the South China problem and the Xinjiang problem and other human rights problems. We should also focus, and perhaps predominantly for the time being, focus on the issues which unite the United States and China, such as climate change, environmental issues, but also trade relations, because both countries are, of course, dependent on their mutual trade relations with each other. So there is a way forward, and perhaps some wise statesmen and stateswomen of our times find that way to constructively engage with the other large power, because otherwise we may well see an ultimate clash, which would be absolutely disastrous. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Klaus, for this inspiring presentation. You've taken us really throughout the history and well, the issues that we've got to deal with in the present crisis, present war. Now it's time for questions and answers and comments from the floor, from the participants. So please, you may either ask directly or just put your question in the chat. Great presentation for sure, says Edgar. Yes, from Janet, please. Sorry, you are muted, Janet.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this fine presentation, so comprehensively covering the state of the world at this time. And so I have many questions, but the one I'll choose is, I'm wondering, in this great powers picture, you said that the nation states are still powerful. And I'm wondering about that, especially in the relation to corporations, because we can feel, I'm from the United States, I sometimes wonder if the corporations are the citizens of the United States, for example, or the UN, since Ted Turner came in and started, the corporate money started supporting the UN more than the nation states. And so I'm wondering how these powers also play into the very fine and comprehensive picture that you presented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks very much. This is, of course, an important point. Corporations are highly important, particularly the big international one. Think of Amazon and Facebook and Apple and similar ones. In Germany, the major car companies are certainly have an important role to play when the government comes up with economic policies, and they certainly, via their lobbyists, put a lot of pressure on Parliament when Parliament draws up laws. One should not, in the past, when you think of 100 years ago in the United States, you had the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, which were already highly influential. But in the end, I believe the state so far has proven to be more powerful. It doesn't mean that corporations are not powerful or will not continue to be powerful, but in the last resort, the state has proven to be more enduring. And when you think of the recent international agreement to cut the international tax rate on multilateral corporations to something like, not to cut it, to have a minimum tax threshold for international corporation of at least 10%, that of course was very controversial, and many countries didn't want to go along with it, and corporations certainly didn't always approve of it, but that was pushed through. And I think that is a sign that there is international cooperation possible, even regarding such huge conglomerates. But you are right, this is a serious problem. And related to that, actually, particularly in the United States, this a problem is the role of money in politics. The way individual congressmen and senators are influenced or bribed or bought with money, with corporate money, so that they, vote accordingly. This is all not very transparent. It's all very indirect. Clearly, we don't really know very well, or only sometimes we find out, often only by accident. You had the huge information which recently came onto the world via these huge tax issues, tax papers and documents which were collected by papers like the New York Times and the Guardian and others. But these are only, I would say, occasional revelations of what is going on beyond the surface. More could certainly be done, clearly.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Klaus. Now we go to Afiz, and then we go to Fabio after Afiz. Afiz, please proceed.
Thank you. I really appreciate your presentation. It was really nice, and it really captured what is actually going on and what may likely give us the solution to the war that is going on in the world. And if you made mention something that I'm not clear in your presentation, I would like if you can clarify that. It says since 1945, there is always involved a state of nation in the war. This, I need clarification of this. I'm not clear about that. Then you made mention that the essence of China supporting Russia in this war is because they are getting gas to Russia so that they can use it to run their states. Is it not possible for Russia to go in agreement with China, or is it not possible for China, let me put it like that, to go in agreement with Russia to get gas rather than supporting them in war? So I think we don't need war to settle economic matter. Then you made mention that you are going to present three things. You are going to present power politics. I only grab the power politics. I don't get the other two aspects that you said you are going to present for us. Thank you.
Right. I didn't understand everything you said because the connection was very bad, but I believe you asked about why China and the United States do not side together in order to overcome the war in Ukraine. And to be honest, I argued like that at the beginning of the war, that China should really step up and also improve its global image and reputation by being seen as a peacemaker in that conflict in Ukraine. And unfortunately, this hasn't happened. And I think I mentioned 3 points while China decided to stay out of it, to be neutral if you want to be benign, or to be really coming down on the side of Russia if you want to be a little bit more realistic. And it's quite interesting when you look at Chinese domestic rhetoric and its rhetoric on its international channel, CGTN, for example. CGTN is actually quite neutral, quite objective, and is not pushing a pro-Russian line at all. Maybe a little bit, but not too much. But when you look at Chinese domestic television and domestic outlets, then it is clear that the pro-Russian line is pushed like 90% of all the time. There's nothing like a differentiated view. The West is blamed for the war in Ukraine as if the West had invaded, while the Russians are painted as the innocent victims. And this is, of course, a lot of nonsense. The aggressor clearly is Russia. Mistakes were made on the West, clearly, but this does not mean, this does not justify the invasion of a foreign country and the targeting of civilians and civilian institutions, of housing blocks, of hospitals, and so on. And China, I believe, had the possibility to come down as a peacemaker and try to mediate between the two sides in the Ukrainian war. But it has not chosen to do so because it doesn't want to lose Russia as a geopolitical and geoeconomic ally. It is dependent on, or believes it is dependent in the last resort on some important resources from Russia. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, in the meantime, under Xi Jinping, the anti-American animosity in China has become so strong that Xi Jinping seems to be in support of Putin, also just for the very fact that Russia is taking on America. That it's an anti-American motivation which unites, at the moment at least, Russia and China to a significant extent. There's another issue which is always mentioned, which I personally don't think is that important, but may play a role, is that China doesn't want to lose face. If China admitted that it was actively mediating in the conflict, and then it wouldn't get anywhere, the mediation would be unsuccessful, then many in Beijing would see that as a diplomatic loss of face. Whether this would be that important, it's difficult to judge. And I believe that behind or under the surface, behind the scenes, China is actually doing more than we are being told in public. But it certainly is not doing enough, because if it was doing enough, there would be an end to the war. And the end to the war, unfortunately, cannot be seen anywhere right now.
Thank you very much. And Fulvio, please.
Yes, thank you. I fully agree with Klaus about still the present state of the war in Ukraine and the future global order. I would like to ask him to elaborate more about the future global order, taking into account that the present world order has been created by creating the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, the World Trade Organizations. They issued some policies that the state had to comply with, also with domestic policies. Now, the future global order is to take into consideration making a global policy towards climate change, maybe also towards pandemics. All these conditions means that the United States and China had to agree on reconstructing either the existing international institutions, reforming it or creating new one, and share that the countries, once these institutions produce an agreement, a treaty, a policy, the countries have to implement these policies with national policies in agreement with the world policy. Is this how this could happen, that United States, China reconstruct institutions and obtain from all the states implementation of the world policies? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. The good point. You're right. The international order needs to be amended, needs to be repaired, if you like. And institutions like the United Nations Security Council are very useful. I think they have proven their value, but they are a little bit out of date. You wonder, what does the UK and France do on the UN Security Council? Shouldn't there be a European seat, perhaps, for example? Also, of course, Africa is not represented. The Middle East is not represented. Latin America is not represented, or only occasionally when these non-veto wielding powers are being added to the Security Council. So there is an urgent need to reform the UN Security Council. The same applies to the IMF and to the World Bank, where the voting rights of a country such as China do not come close to their real economic importance. That has annoyed the Chinese, but also others for some time. The same applies to other international organizations where sometimes the United States and sometimes China haven't even joined, like the International Criminal Court. Why is the United States not a member of that? And there are many other institutions where you could also say that, and it also sometimes applies to China and other countries. So in a way, you're right, the international order needs to be reformed, and countries should definitely join important institutions. However, I believe in a reform rather than revolution. You could, of course, throw it all out and start at the beginnings, that we are beginning again with setting up a new UN Security Council. We abandon the current one and start building up from scratch. This is probably not going to work, and it would be very difficult to get any united opinion on that, to do that. But a reform should be possible. And a reform is only difficult at the moment as the 2 and 3 major protagonists, the United States, China, and Russia, cannot agree on anything. And that right now we are in a war situation, as you know, so agreement is even less likely. And I cannot see how that can be, how the system can be reformed if the main protagonists are at loggerheads and couldn't even talk about certain issues like sanctions policy, how that could then be used to lead to a major reform of the structure of these international institutions. So while I agree with you in principle that reform is utterly necessary, I really cannot see a way forward. And China has really, in a way, abandoned that and has set up its own institutions, particularly its own Asian economic institutions, its own banks, and that is a way around it. And the United States has often not been too skillful in responding to that by refusing to join rather than hopping on the bandwagon and becoming a member of the Asian Development Bank, for example, which is not a wise policy either. But I really don't have a solution how to reform that institutional setup. If I had a solution, I think I would be immediately catapulted to be Secretary General of the United Nations.
Thank you so much. Liu Cheng, please.
Many thanks, Professor Klaus. It's a wonderful speech because your lecture many times mentioned about China. So I'm Chinese professor for history. So also peace studies. I must say something to dispense your lecture. In your lecture, you list 3 points about China, why the Chinese position or attitude to this kind of war. I want to end something for China side. Why our attitude to this kind of war? I'm professor for British history. I know in in British history, they have a very principle of the more and the foreign affairs is in Britain, no forever or permanently interesting, but no permanently and forever friends, but any interesting in Britain history or foreign affairs or diplomatic in Britain. I think this is not any in British countries, but also in the history of a lot of European countries. It means they consider something, especially the war. They usually focus on their own interest to do something, support someone or against someone. This is the culture, unfortunately, in the history of European countries. But this is not the culture of Chinese culture and histories. In Chinese history, we much prefer the friends. You know, this is totally different. So we must consider the Chinese attitude to Russian, to Ukraine. A little difference between American and China. One country only focus on interesting, but another one not any interesting, but also the friends. We must balance the friends, the interesting, our great poor, the position, everything. This is the culture of China. And also I want to add something. This is the war happened between a country and another country, but both of them in Europe. Of course, in the history, also have a lot of war happened out of Europe, but any war happened in Europe were linked to Great War. For example, the World War I, the World War II. So for a Chinese, we very, very worry about the Ukraine war to Russia, because this is the war very easy to link the another Great War. For example, the Third Great War is very dangerous. But in the history, any war in European countries can link the Great War. So when we talk about this topic, we must think about it. Why in European countries always have this kind of war to link the Great War? We must criticize themselves, their history, their culture, also their critical thinking to another culture, another countries, especially China. If we don't use this kind of critical thinking to ourselves, we couldn't understand another side. This is Chinese the culture or Chinese thinking. So China is a long distance to the war. China is not to give the support, the weapon support to Russia, to Ukraine. China wants mediation to stop the war, because the war is not any interesting to China. China is rising because of the peace. We need the peace to rebuild, to continue our economic development. We don't want to touch another peace, another interesting. But a lot of European countries during this war always criticize China. Chinese people, Chinese government should do this. Chinese people, Chinese government should do that. We are also adult. We are also a state. We also opening to learning American, Germany, British. Everything is good. We want to do learning, but it's not the other side. It's have the same opening, the feeling of the opening mind. I think this is the reason. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the word is how to say. Every country, they have their right to do the right things. They think is right. This is the equal rights. Also, there are a lot of African countries. They also have their opinion because they are interesting, because of their culture. Maybe they have different idea or different way to deal with this kind of war, just happened in European countries. Mm-hmm. It's not means every way must follow the idea of American or Western European countries is right or right.
No,
they have different opinion. So this is my not question, just make a comments, because Professor actually meet in South Korea. We also have dialogue in Korea. Absolutely. So also your speech many times to mention about China. Actually, China don't want to touch these kind of things. We only focus on our Chinese, a lot of problem. You talked about it. A lot Taiwan issues, also Tibet, also Hong Kong, a lot of issues in China, also economic issues. We just want to focus on our issues. Okay? So I just want to
Yeah, thank you. Let me ask you. So basically you say the Ukrainian war is a European war, and the Europeans were not able to really prevent it. So it's their problem, and China hasn't really got anything to do with it. Is that?
No, this is not my opinion.
Yeah.
Actually, Chinese government already to do something to deal with the problem. It's happened in European countries. But my question is, this war is happened in European countries. And in history, this kind of war very open to happen in European. Also, some war is linked, of course, the Great War. So European countries must critically thinking why this kind of things very open to happen in European countries.
Of course.
This is my thinking. It's not say, oh, this is European wars. China is outside. We do nothing. No. This is not my opinion. It's opinion. We must use this opportunity for European countries, also American. Sorry, that's good. Professor is here. They also think by themselves if they do something wrong. So this kind of war happened in Europe. This is my question, okay, or my opinion. Thank you very much. Actually, many thanks for your excellent lectures about the Ukraine war. It's helped me to thinking.
Thank you for your comment. Yeah. Thank you.
Right, I'm trying to look for a question. I think in chat I saw there's a question from Ronald, and he's saying, Prof, you mentioned China's neutrality in this war. Towards Russia, so again about China. Do you consider this neutrality a betrayal to peace building?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I think it is a shame because China has become a big international player. With being an important country, responsibility comes. And if China has the opportunity to bring something like a ceasefire about, it should not refuse to try to do that. And other countries such as Turkey, who sees itself, much less important than China on the global stage, but Turkey sees itself as a very important regional player, and it feels that it should really stand up to its responsibilities and try to do its best to bring both sides together. And if China had that possibility, then I think it should use that possibility. It would also help China's reputation on the world stage, I believe, because if China brought about a ceasefire in Ukraine, everyone would definitely be impressed by that, and it would enhance China's international reputation quite a bit. And not doing so is, in a way, a waste of an opportunity.
Perfect. Any other questions or comments from the attendees? Well, if I don't see a question, I can also ask to make one about the role of academics and political international analysts, international affairs analysts. It seems that this war kind of caught us or caught them unawares, that most of the scholars that I could read their works really said there was no possibility that there could be a war anymore. In fact, the war was yesterday. So I wonder whether the analysis that was done was probably not clear enough or not comprehensive enough. If you would like to comment on that, the role of the analysts and scholars like yourselves.
So I agree. Yeah, no, that is what I referred to at the beginning. when I said that the world of great power politics has never gone away. We only believed it had gone away, and we focused on issues such as, let's say, softer domestic issues like economic development, like gender politics and environmental issues and identity politics. So we were focusing on ourselves, largely on our own countries or our own region, and were really inward looking. And relatively few scholars were looking at international relations in a more global sphere. And many of them did not believe that Russia would invade. And you saw for months, you saw the increase of Russian troops and Russian equipment at the border to Ukraine. And we still believed that Putin was bluffing, that he wouldn't actually use these troops. And I believe, 100 years ago, we probably, if we had seen that sort of development, we probably immediately would have jumped to the conclusion, yes, he's not going to amass his troops at the border to Ukraine without having the intention to do something. In a way, we were led by our own wishful thinking that a modern leader of a country would not use force to get his way with a neighboring country. And we were, of course, all deeply mistaken about that. And we really didn't want to learn the lessons of only the recent past. We had the Crimean invasion of 2014. So we knew that Putin was quite capable of doing an invasion. We had the attack on Grozny a few years before that. We had the Russia's activities in Syria, which also led to the use of brutal force, like against cities like Aleppo. And despite all these lessons, we still refused to believe that he would actually invade Ukraine, that he wanted to use instead his military force just as political pressure material. And in a way, I would say we were misled by our own wishful thinking and by being a little naive. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Klaus. There is a question in chat from Ronald. He's asking about the kind of the level of percentage of cooperation in the world, towards ending this war. The cooperation.
Yeah, I mean, I understand. You're frozen. Yeah, I understand there are talks going on at a very low level and which are not being revealed in order not to endanger any possible progress. But it certainly is not as intensive as it should be. And it is difficult to know why, but first of all, the Ukrainians don't want to lose any of that territory, which is perfectly understandable. They don't want to have a smaller Ukraine, and they have the upper hand right now with strong support with Western weapons. It seems they have the upper hand, so they don't want to really concede loss of the territory. Then when you look at Russia, Russia is really close to defeat. Putin is not achieving any of his objectives. How can he enter into ceasefire negotiations and then go home and declare he has had some sort of victory? That would be very humiliating for him. Maybe his very rule in the Kremlin would be endangered. So I guess from his point of view, he's very reluctant to do anything like that without being able to show a clear victory that he has gained something significant from the war in Ukraine. And the more time passes, the more difficult it will be for him. British intelligence sources recently reported that 1/3 of all the Russian forces coming into Ukraine have been killed, have been destroyed. These would be 30,000 to 40,000 soldiers. That is a huge number of people, and I feel very sorry for these, poor Russian conscripts who were really were just cannon fodder. They were no match for what was hitting them on the ground in Ukraine. Often, as I said, they didn't even know that they were participating in a war rather than in exercises. So they are not to be blamed at all. It is the leadership, of course, Putin and the military leadership, which drives them into that war. I cannot see that the war will end without Putin being able to show that he has obtained some significant success. And that is, of course, what the Ukrainians do not want to admit, do not want to concede. And therefore, unless a miracle happens, the war will continue for quite some time, unfortunately.
Thank you so much. I don't seem to see another question. We still have, yes, Nick, please.
Yes, thank you, George, and thank you, Professor Larres. Vielen Dank für diese wonderful presentation. I would actually, because I've been living myself in China for quite some time now, almost 17 years, and have also been here in China working with Professor Liu, I'd like to say a little bit about my response as a European and American citizen living in China, knowing China quite well and respecting Chinese people, and also being somewhat familiar with Chinese history. I'd like to say that at the beginning, at the outset of that war, and I think my words here also reflect the feelings of many China hands, as you call them, and other people in Europe and the world that know something about China. I felt really disappointed that China missed this opportunity to step up in the world as a peace builder, as an agent of peace, because as Professor Liu have pointed out, China is very much a peaceful culture. So why is it that China seems so focused on itself and almost seems to be rejecting its role to step up in the world and be a positive force for peace in the world that we both know China can be and should be? Just a really quick question here, or a comment, I guess.
I totally disagree with the opinion of Mr. Dick.
Thank you. I'm talking about my feeling. I'm not talking about my opinion. It is my feeling that I was very disappointed. So.
You can say something about the German style or American. Why? This is a judge. How to say? This is how to say? Maybe this is, you talk about Chinese culture, and your style of speaking is totally different, like Chinese cultural style. For Chinese people, we're not easy to say, oh, American government should do this, or German government should do that. We just want to say, ask, why, Mr. Nick, to be American people or to be German people? Why in this event you make this position? Not to say Chinese government like culture, this is an opportunity, but the Chinese government, China lost the opportunity. This means you make a judgment. This is not an academic discussion. You know, you are just PhD candidate. You are PhD candidate. We are academic discussion. Okay, this is very important. So you say you stay in China many years, but unfortunately, actually your PhD candidate, the first PhD dissertation is about China, but it's ancient China. But I don't think you're learning much deep about the culture of China, even the history of China, especially the normal Chinese people thinking, especially some people is sit down in this conference, even this is a Zoom conference. This is the culture,
All right.
peace culture, okay? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Because you talked about China.
Leo.
You talked about China. You are American, you are Germany, but you talked about China. I must respond. Even
Oh, yeah, I am sorry, Professor. You allow me to
also
respond. You
Chinese.
talk about
You can
England
also
as
give
well.
a response. I suggestion 13, you are friend for Dick. You can also say something.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, both Leo and Nick.
I suggestion.
Yes, please.
Today we have two Chinese people, except Professor Liu, also 13. She is a PhD candidate in Japan. Just now she returned to China. I very welcome. I think you also welcome to 13 to share her opinion about Chinese attitude to this kind of war.
Sure.
Why not?
Sure. Lovely. Lovely. Great. And I don't know whether Klaus, you want to respond, say something about this discussion. Okay, there is Fulvio and then Les. I'll begin with Fulvio, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry to make another comment, but I think what Professor Liu said is very important because it demonstrates that what Klaus said about reforming the world order means that the world is not ripe for making this reform of the existing world order. Now, looking back to history, when the disorder comes to be unsustainable, like in this case with the violation of the Security Council security role, in the past, always the change of order has been decided through a world war. Now it is very important instead that the great powers, the three great powers, take their own responsibilities and go to negotiations about reforming the order. This will end the Ukrainian war as well as end the world disorder. I don't know if this helped the discussion.
Great. And Les, if you hear us, you wanted to make a comment?
Hi, yeah, I'm sorry I arrived late. I got a message from our daughter in England who needed money, and so I had to run to the bank. So Janet said, world affairs and family affairs. I said, all I had to do was send money and the crisis was averted. I wish that it was so easy to solve these the world problems. But I wanted to sort of applaud the effort to have this transnational conversation and point out how important it is for us to continue having these cross fertilizations and trying to understand, especially at this point, the Chinese perspective, because I think we don't get enough of that in much of our thinking, and keeping as tensions heat up between what's now this kind of strange conglomeration of America and Europe. The Europeans have already lost their empire. America is now losing its empire. Empire status, right? It's still extremely powerful, has a very important role to play in the world. But to keep lines open across these various divides that are deepening is extremely important. And I'm glad to see us having this opportunity here. So I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for engaging in that, and look forward to some deepening of these kinds of conversations in a peace studies environment.
Thank you, Les.
Some of the other environments. Thanks.
Thank you, Les. I would like to agree with you. It's very important and very interesting to have these perspectives from various parts of the world and learn more about the different perspectives. I mean, in a way, it's difficult to disagree with Professor Lee. On the other hand, it is also easy to disagree, because I think the nation state, and I'm not talking about particularly about China or India or the United States or Germany or France, but inherently a nation state is not peaceful. A nation state wants to defend its borders. It is aggressive, and it is not peaceful. Maybe the government of that nation state sometimes is more peaceful or less peaceful. That depends on the nature of that government and who leads it and who is part of the government. But it's difficult to see the international environment as a number of peaceful states, which only occasionally is interrupted by an aggressor like Russia right now, and everyone else is really quite peaceful. I think it's the other way around, that we are surrounded by nation states which are quite on the alert, which are quite envious and jealous, and also assertive and aggressive, and that it is the skill of scholars and the skill of diplomats and politicians to keep it or prevent it from breaking out. And we, of course, were not able to prevent Russia's aggression against Ukraine in 2022. And that this is a defeat for all of us. You know, scholars, politicians, diplomats, you know, if we had been successful, Russia would not have invaded. We would have been able to convince Russia to obtain its grievances, to satisfy its grievances by non-military means. And, you know, whenever you have an aggression, be it domestic aggression or international aggression, you cannot go and say, my policy was successful. That always is a defeat, clearly. When people are dying, particularly totally innocent people like civilians, that is clearly a defeat. And so there's a lot of work to be done, how to, first of all, resolve the current war, of course, and secondly, to prevent any similar war from breaking out. And we should certainly draw lessons from the Ukraine war and use it for other conflicts, including, of course, Taiwan, but many other conflicts in Mali, in around the world, in the Middle East, in Libya, in many, almost on all continents. And no country really has the dominance of opinion that they are more peaceful than other countries. I don't think that any one country is more assertive, more aggressive, more peaceful, more benign. I think the nature of international relations is actually assertive and aggressive. And there's not much difference between countries, I would say. And of course, you can say if a small country is aggressive, it matters less than if a big country is aggressive. This is pretty obvious because the technological power, economic power, which goes with it is totally different. But that is more or less the only real difference. But thank you all for chipping into the conversation. And thank you again for inviting me. It has been very stimulating. And I would like to remind you at the end, perhaps, that if you're interested in the lectures and discussions on international relations I'm running myself here at the University of North Carolina, then please don't hesitate to send me an email. That is my last name, Larres @unc.edu. And I will happily put you on my mailing list and you will get information about the Zoom events. And thank you very much, George, for taking the initiative again.
Lovely. Thank you so much for this inspiring talk. And we will definitely watch the videos and join the Krasno events series. And I would like to thank everybody else for this really interesting talk and debate today. I'm sorry that really the times now is not our best ally. So we'll be joining again this next webinar next week, next Wednesday, as usual. So thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.